The moment the small, warm weight settled against his chest, Duke Kedman Ravarin knew that his careful lie had been undone by a creature far too young to understand she had undone it. He had been pretending to sleep for the better part of an hour. It was the one deception the household allowed him. Every afternoon that summer, he had walked out beyond the silver-leaf orchards of Brackenmere Hollow to the ancient moon willow that leaned over the cliff path above the northern sea, and there he had lain back in the long grass with his hat over his eyes and let the whole world believe him asleep. No footman would dare wake a sleeping duke. No steward would trouble him with ledgers. No aunt would arrive with the names of suitable young ladies. No letter from the capital would find him. Beneath that tree, for one stolen hour, Kedman Ravarin was nobody at all, and nobody was the only man he had ever wished to be. But now something had climbed into his lie and made itself at home. He did not move. Through the narrow gap beneath his hat brim, he could just make out a tumble of pale golden curls, a small round cheek, a fist, no larger than a plum, closed loosely in the fabric of his coat. A child, a very small child, perhaps 3 years old, who had toddled across half the orchard on unsteady legs, found a long, quiet shape resting in the grass, and decided, with the perfect logic of the very young, that this was a good and safe place to rest as well. She had curled against him the way a kitten curls against anything warm, and now she gave a small, contented sigh and went still. And Kedman felt her breathing slow into sleep against his ribs. He was, by every account whispered through the northern counties, a cold man, distant, unreachable, the Duke who spoke little and smiled less. He'd heard the words often enough to half believe them himself. Yet lying there beneath the moon willow, with a stranger's child asleep on his chest, he discovered that he could not bring himself to wake her, could not bear to end the small miracle of being trusted so completely by something that wanted nothing from him at all. Not his title, not his fortune, only the warmth of a place to sleep in the shade. So the Duke of Brackenmere Hollow lay perfectly still under his tree, scarcely breathing, and guarded the sleep of a child whose name he did not yet know. It was into this impossible scene that her mother came running. Kedman heard her before he saw her, the swift, panicked rush of skirts through the orchard grass, a voice pitched low and frightened, calling a name softly so as not to alarm. "Nerissa, Nerissa, sweetling, where have you got to?" Then the footsteps stopped short a little distance off, and there was a silence so complete that he could hear the sea breaking far below the cliffs, and he understood that the mother had found her daughter and had also found precisely where the child had chosen to sleep. He lifted the hat from his face. The young woman standing at the edge of the willow's shade went the color of ash. She was, he saw at once, quite remarkably lovely, though she plainly had no notion of it and no time to spare for it. She was perhaps 22, slight and dark-haired, with a face made for gentleness, and eyes the deep grey of the sea in the hour before a storm. Her hair had come half loose from its pins in her running and lay in dark coils against a neck the colour of cream. She wore the plain grey stuff dress of a household maid, mended carefully at the cuff, and she held one hand pressed to her breast as though to keep her heart from leaving it. She was beautiful in the way that hard use and hidden sorrow sometimes make a face beautiful, which is to say she was beautiful without ever having been told so. "Your Grace." Her voice shook. She dropped at once into a curtsy so low it was nearly a collapse. "Your Grace, forgive me, I beg you. Forgive her, she does not know. She is only 3 years old and she wandered from me. She does not understand what she has done. Please, I will take her this instant. Please do not be angry with her. She is only a baby. Punish me if you must, but not the child. Never the child." The words tumbled out of her in a rush of pure terror, and Kedman understood the terror perfectly. He had seen what became of servants who displeased great houses. He had grown up in a family that could end a person's whole living with a single cold sentence over the breakfast table. This young woman believed, with good reason, that her daughter's small trespass upon a duke might cost them both the roof over their heads, and she was offering herself in the child's place before he had said a single word. It grieved him more than he could easily say. "Be at peace," he said quietly. "No one here is angry, least of all with her." The maid lifted her eyes to his, and he watched disbelief war with hope in them, and neither quite won. Nerissa chose that moment to wake. She stirred against his chest, blinked up at the leaves and the light, and then turned her small face up to the man beneath her with the frank and fearless curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that some people are meant to be feared. She had her mother's dark grey eyes set in a round, rosy face, and a scattering of golden curls, and a small rosebud mouth that now curved slowly into a smile of such uncomplicated delight that Caedmon felt something long frozen in him crack quietly down the middle. "You woke up," Nerissa informed him gravely. "So did you," he said. "I slept on you." "You did. You are an excellent sleeper. I have rarely been slept upon so thoroughly." The child considered this a great compliment, as it was meant to be, and beamed. Then she reached up one plump hand and patted him firmly on the cheek twice, as though confirming that he was real, and declared to the orchard at large, "He is a nice tree." Caedmon laughed. It came out of him unguarded, a real laugh, warm and surprised, the sort of sound the household of Brackenmere Hollow had not heard from its master in longer than anyone could remember. And the young maid, Serapha Vey, standing frozen at the edge of the shade with her whole heart in her mouth, heard that laugh and looked at the cold and distant Duke of every whispered rumour, and saw that the rumours had been telling her lies. "She calls everything a tree that she can climb upon," Serapha said faintly. "I am so very sorry." "Do not be." Caedmon sat up with great care, keeping one hand at the child's back so she would not tumble, and settled her gently onto the grass. "It is the finest thing anyone has called me in a year. What is her name?" "Nerissa, your grace." "And yours?" The young woman hesitated, as though the question of her own name were a strange and unexpected thing to be asked by such a man. "Serapha Vey. I am under maid to the still room, your grace. We keep to the lower gardens as a rule. She has never wandered so far before. I promise you it shall not happen again." "That," said Caedmon, "would be a very great pity." And he meant it, and Serapha heard that he meant it, and neither of them knew quite what to do with a thing so simply and so dangerously said. She gathered her daughter up and made her curtsies and fled, of course. That was the only sensible course, and Serapha Vey had been sensible every hour of her life since sense was the only thing standing between her child and ruin. But as she carried Nerissa back down through the silver-leaf orchards toward the lower servants' wing, the little girl twisted round in her arms to look back at the man beneath the tree, and lifted one small hand and waved, and the Duke of Brackenmere Hollow, who was not supposed to notice servants at all, lifted his hand from where he sat in the long grass and gravely waved back. That should have been the end of it. In a well-ordered aristocratic house, it would have been the end of it. But Brackenmere Hollow stood alone on its misted island off the wild Northumberland coast in the summer of 1848, a full day's difficult journey from the nearest town and further still from the eyes of society. And on that island the ordinary rules of the world wore thin as sea fog, and a child of 3 years old, once she has decided a person is hers, is not easily governed by the rules of anyone. The very next afternoon, Nerissa escaped her mother's watchful eye the moment Serapha's back was turned, and toddled her way up through the orchards to the moon willow, and found the nice tree waiting for her exactly where she had left him. Caedmon had told himself he was not waiting. He had told himself a great many things. But he had walked out to the willow a full hour early, and he had not laid down to pretend to sleep at all, and when the small, determined figure came stumping up the slope with her golden curls bouncing, he found that his heart lifted in a way he had entirely forgotten hearts could do. "You came back," he said. "I came back," Nerys agreed, and climbed into his lap without the slightest ceremony, and began at once to tell him a long and passionate story about a snail she had met that morning, of which he understood perhaps one word in 5 and treasured every one. Serafa found them so a quarter of an hour later, breathless and frightened all over again. But this time, when she reached the shade of the willow, the Duke looked up at her and did a thing no man of his rank had ever done in her presence. He patted the grass beside him in open invitation and said, "Sit down, Miss Vey. She is telling me about a snail of great importance, and I am wholly out of my depth. I need a translator." Serafa did not sit. She could not possibly sit. A duke did not invite a still-room maid to sit beside him in the grass, and a maid who valued her place did not accept if he did. But she did not flee either. She stood at the edge of the shade, with her hands folded and her heart going hard, and she watched the man who ruled the whole island, listened to her daughter's nonsense as though it were the wisest counsel in the kingdom, and she felt something she had sworn years ago never to feel again begin to stir treacherously in her chest. "She talks a great deal," Serafa said by way of apology. "She talks," said Caedmon, "like a person who has been given very little cause to believe anyone was listening. I know something about how that feels." He did not look up from the child as he said it. "I mean to correct it in her case. Will you truly not sit?" "It would not be proper, Your Grace." "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose it would." He looked up then, and there was something rueful and tired and honest in his handsome face that undid a little more of her caution. "Very little of what makes me happy has ever been thought proper, Miss Vey. I have begun to suspect that it is not my fault. It may be a fault in what people have agreed to call proper. She did not sit that day, but she came a little further into the shade, and it was a beginning. So began the secret summer of the moon willow. It was never spoken of, and it was never named, and both of the grown people involved would have denied to their last breath that it was anything at all. Yet every afternoon, when the great house drowsed, and the sea mist burned off the orchards, and the long gold light came slanting through the silver-leaf trees, they met beneath the leaning willow above the cliffs. Nerys ruled these gatherings absolutely. She decided what games were played and what stories were told and who was permitted to sit where. She named the Duke her tree, and then, as the days went on, promoted him to other offices, sometimes her horse, sometimes her mountain, once, memorably, her dragon, a role he performed with a commitment that reduced her to shrieks of joy and reduced her mother, watching to helpless laughter she could not stifle in time. And it was that laughter, more than anything, that undid them both. For when Serafa Vey laughed, the careful grey mask she wore for the world slipped clean away, and what stood beneath it was so lovely and so alive that Caedmon Ravarin found he could not look at anything else. And when the Duke played the fool in the grass for the sake of a small girl's delight, the cold, distant mask that the whole kingdom believed to be his true face fell away as well, and what stood beneath it was a lonely and gentle and painfully kind man, and Serafa found that she could not stop herself from loving what she saw, however sternly she commanded her heart to cease. They talked in the hours while Nerys hunted snails and picked fistfuls of orchard clover. They talked as neither of them had talked to another living soul in years. He learned that Serafa had come to the island 4 years before, a bride of 18, married to a young fisherman of the village named Toran Vey, a good man, a kind man, lost with his boat in the great storm 2 winters past when Nerys was scarcely walking. He learned that the village had been unkind to a widow left alone with a fatherless child, that whispers had followed her, that she had taken the still-room place at the great house because it put a wall of good stone between her daughter and the cruelty of small minds. He learned that she had not once in all that time allowed herself to hope for anything beyond survival, because hope, she told him quietly, was a luxury for women who had something left to lose. and she learned that the great Duke of Brackenmere Hollow was the loneliest man she had ever met. She learned that his mother had died bearing him, and his father had never forgiven him for it, that he had been raised by cold tutors and colder relations in a house the size of a village, taught that a Ravarin feels nothing, needs no one, bends to no affection. She learned that he had been groomed since boyhood to marry where it would benefit the family, and to love where it was permitted, which was nowhere. And she learned that this was why he hid beneath a tree each afternoon and pretended to sleep, because it was the only hour in his whole ordered golden life in which no one wanted anything from him, and he was allowed simply to exist. "You are not cold at all," she said to him one evening wonderingly as the light went amber over the sea. Nerissa had fallen asleep in the grass between them with a crown of clover crushed in her fist. "The whole world says you are made of ice, and here you are." "The world says a great many things about me," Cadman answered. He was watching the sleeping child, but his voice was low and rough. "It has never once troubled me to ask whether they were true. You are the first person in 20 years, Miss Vey, to look at me and see a man rather than a title. Do you know what a rare and dangerous thing that is?" "Dangerous?" "For me," he said. "Yes, very." She should have understood the warning in it. Perhaps she did. But the amber light was on his face, and the child slept safe between them, and the sea sang its old song against the cliffs below, and Serapha Vey, who had sworn never again to hope, felt hope rise in her like the tide, and could not for her life command it down. That was the summer's high sweetness, and because the world is what it is, the sweetness could not last. The letter came in the first week of September. Serapha knew something had happened the moment she saw him beneath the willow that afternoon. He was standing, not sitting, with his back to the orchard and his face to the sea, and his shoulders were set in the old cold way she had almost forgotten he possessed. Nerissa ran to him as she always did and flung her arms about his leg, and he laid a hand on her curls, but he did not smile, and Serapha felt the tide inside her go suddenly, terribly still. "What has happened?" she said. He turned. His handsome face was grey. "My grandmother is coming to the island," he said. "The Dowager Duchess. She arrives within the fortnight." He paused and made himself say the rest of it, because he was not a coward, and he would not lie to her. "She is bringing with her the Lady Ophira Callanmore of the Western Marches. It has been arranged these 3 years, Miss Vey, before ever I set eyes on you. A marriage, advantageous. The family lands march with ours along the western coast, and the union would double the house's holdings and its standing at court. My grandmother means to see it settled and announced before Michaelmas." He looked away. "I am to be betrothed." The words fell into the golden afternoon like stones into a still pool. For a long moment, Serapha could not breathe at all. Then she bent very carefully and gathered her daughter up into her arms and held the small warm weight against her as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had begun to tilt. "I see," she said. Her voice, she was distantly proud to notice, did not shake. Then this was always going to end. I always knew that it would. I was foolish to forget it even for a summer, Serapha. It was the first time he had ever used her name alone, without the miss before it, and the sound of it in his mouth nearly broke her. "Do not," she said, "please, do not say it kindly. If you say it kindly, I shall not be able to bear it, and I have a child to think of and a place to keep, and I cannot afford to be unable to bear things." She stepped back from him into the ordinary daylight beyond the willow's shade. "You are a duke, Your Grace. I'm a still room maid and the widow of a drowned fisherman. There was never any world in which this was anything but a summer's dream. I thank you for the dream. It was more than I ever thought to have. But it is finished now, and we must both wake. And she turned, with her daughter in her arms, and walked away down through the silver-leaf orchards, and this time she did not look back, and neither did Nerys, because Nerys had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder and did not know that anything at all had ended. Caedmon Rivarin stood beneath the moon-willow and watched them go, and did not call out, because he was a duke, and dukes do not call out, and duty is duty, and love asks permission of rank and title and tradition, always, always, as he had been taught since before he could walk. He was still telling himself this a fortnight later, when his grandmother arrived. The Dowager Duchess of Brackenmere Hollow came onto the island like weather. She was 80 years old and straight as a mast, with a face carved from the same cold stone as the house itself, and eyes that missed nothing in a room. She had buried a husband and 2 sons, and had governed the family's fortunes through it all with a hand of iron, and she was accustomed to being obeyed by kings. With her came the Lady Ophira Callanmore, and Caedmon, meeting his intended bride for the first time in the great hall, understood at once that his troubles had grown more complicated rather than less, for Lady Ophira was neither cruel, nor foolish, nor cold. She was a tall, graceful young woman of perhaps 20 years, with russet hair and a clever, watchful, unhappy face. And when she made her curtsy to him, her eyes met his with a frank and weary understanding that told him plainly she wanted this marriage no more than he did. She was, he would learn, being sold to it exactly as he was, by a family that valued lands above the wishes of daughters. They were 2 prisoners, he and she, being locked into the same cell, and expected to be grateful for the company. The betrothal was to be announced at a great dinner 3 nights hence, before all the gentry the island could gather, so that the thing should be public and binding and past all undoing. The dowager arranged it with the ruthless efficiency of a general laying a siege. And Caedmon, walking the cold halls of his own house in the days before that dinner, felt the whole warm, golden summer of the moon willow slipping away from him like sand through his fingers, and told himself that this was what it meant to be a Rivarin, and did not believe it for a single moment. He did not see Serapha in those days. She had asked the still-room mistress to keep her below and out of sight, while the grand guests were in the house, and the request had been granted, for a widowed maid with a fatherless child was exactly the sort of thing a house liked to keep tidily out of the way of its noble visitors. But Nerys was 3 years old, and Nerys did not know that anything had changed, and Nerys had never in her short life met a wall she could not find her way around when she had set her heart on something. And Nerissa had set her heart entirely and forever on her tree. The night of the betrothal dinner was clear and cold, with a great white moon riding over the sea and every candle in the great house of Brackenmere Hollow blazing against the dark. The long hall was filled with the gentry of the north in their silks and their jewels. At the high table sat the Dowager Duchess like a queen, and beside her the Lady Ophira, pale and composed and miserable, and beside her the Duke, handsomer than any man in the room in his dark formal coat, and more wretched than any man in the kingdom. The wine was poured. The dowager rose in the hush to make the announcement that would bind her grandson for the rest of his life. And a small figure in a white nightgown, with a tumble of golden curls and bare pink feet, appeared in the great doorway of the hall. Nerys had woken in the dark of the servants' wing to find her mother gone up to help with the washing of the grand dishes, and she had climbed from her cot, and she had gone in search of the 2 people in the world she loved best. She had followed the light and the noise all the way up through the sleeping-house, past footmen too astonished to stop her, and now she stood in the doorway of that glittering hall full of the most important people in the north. And she looked past every silk and every jewel and every candle, and she saw at the high table the one face she had come to find. "There he is," said Nerys, in the perfect ringing silence, with enormous satisfaction. and she set off across the whole length of the great hall on her small bare feet, straight toward the Duke. No one moved, no one breathed. 80 of the proudest people in the kingdom sat frozen in their chairs and watched a fisherman's orphan cross the floor of that ancient hall as though she owned it, which in every way that mattered, she did. She reached the high table, she reached the Duke, and she lifted up her arms to him in the old familiar way and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that stricken room, "Up, please, I come to find you. You're my tree." Duran Caedmon Ravarin, Duke of Brackenmere Hollow, in front of his grandmother and his intended bride, and the whole assembled gentry of the north, in front of everyone whose good opinion he had been raised to believe was the only thing on earth that mattered, pushed back his chair and knelt down upon the floor of his own great hall and gathered the child up into his arms. "I know," he said to her softly as she wound her arms about his neck. "I know, sweetling. I am sorry I stayed away." The Dowager Duchess found her voice first. "Caedmon!" It cracked across the hall like a whip. "What is the meaning of this? Whose is that child?" He rose to his full height with Nerissa settled against him, and he faced his grandmother and something in him that had been bending since the day he was born, quietly and forever stopped bending. "She is the daughter of one of this household," he said, and his voice was perfectly steady and carried to every ear. "Her name is Nerissa Vey. Her father was a fisherman of this island, who drowned saving nothing but honest men's lives, and her mother is the finest and bravest woman I have ever known. And this child is worth more to me, grandmother, than every acre in the western marches and every good opinion in this room." A sound went through the hall like wind through a wheat field. The Lady Ophira Callanmore at the high table sat very still, and then, slowly, an expression began to dawn across her clever, unhappy face that no one had expected, which was something very like hope. "Caedmon," the Dowager said, and now her old voice shook with fury, "you will put that child down, and you will remember what you are." "I remember exactly what I am," he answered. "I am a man who was raised in this house to feel nothing and to need no one, and who was very nearly successful at it, until a summer ago when a child of 3 years old mistook me for a tree and fell asleep against my heart and taught me in 1 hour more of what a man is for than this family taught me in 30 years. He looked around the silent, glittering hall, at all the proud, cold faces, and he was not afraid of a single one of them any longer. "I will not marry Lady Ophira. I mean her no dishonor, and I believe, if she is as wise as she looks, that she is as glad of it as I am. I will not be sold, and I will not sell her, and I will not spend the rest of my life pretending to be made of ice in order to please people who have never once loved me. I am finished with it. I am finished with all of it." Into the ringing silence that followed, a small voice spoke. "Is you sad?" Nerissa asked him, patting his cheek with grave concern, having understood nothing of the words and everything of the feeling. "Don't be sad. I finded you." And the great Duke of Brackenmere Hollow bowed his head against the child's golden curls in front of the whole assembled north, and was not ashamed of the wetness in his eyes. It was Lady Ophira who broke the terrible spell. She rose from the high table, tall and pale, and suddenly luminously relieved, and she made a deep and graceful curtsy to the Dowager Duchess. "Madam," she said clearly, "I release His Grace from any understanding between our families, gladly and with my whole heart. I have loved another for 2 years, a gentleman of no fortune whatever, and I was to be married against my will exactly as your grandson was. If he has found the courage tonight to refuse a cage, then I find I have found it too. I thank him for it." She turned to Caedmon, and there were tears standing in her own eyes, and she was smiling. "I hope, Your Grace, that you will find your finest and bravest woman, and I hope she says yes, and I hope you will both come one day to the wedding of a Callanmore who married a poor man for love, because there is going to be one now. I have quite decided." And with that she swept from the hall, her head high, freer than she had been in the whole of her life, and left the gentry of the north gaping after her. The Dowager Duchess sat alone at the high table amid the ruins of her arrangement, and for a long moment her carved old face showed nothing at all. Then something moved across it, some old buried grief rising up through 80 years of iron. And here was the twist that no one in that hall could have foreseen, least of all Caedmon. "Bring the child to me," the old woman said. He hesitated, but there was something in her voice he had never heard before, and so he crossed to the high table and set Nerys gently down before her great-grandmother in all but name. The dowager looked at the small girl for a long, long time, and the terrible cold face began, very slowly, to break. "I had a fisherman once," the Dowager Duchess said. Her voice had gone strange and distant, as though she spoke to the child from across 60 years. "On this very island, when I was young and beautiful and no one yet, before they married me to your great-grandfather for his lands. A fisherman with a boat and a laugh and nothing else in the whole world. I loved him more than my life." She reached out one trembling ancient hand and touched a golden curl on the child's head. "They took me away and married me to duty, and I obeyed, because I was a good girl and I did what I was told, and I have been sorry every single day of the 60 years since. Every day, child. I made myself into stone so that it should not hurt, and I taught my sons to be stone, and my sons taught you." Her old eyes lifted to Caedmon's face, and they were streaming. "And I very nearly did to you the exact thing that was done to me, and I called it your duty, and I would have watched you go grey and cold and sorry, just as I did." "Grandmother," Caedmon said very low. "Marry her," the dowager said fiercely, "whoever she is. The still-room maid, the fisherman's widow, this brave child's mother, whoever she is. Marry her tomorrow. Do not wait. Do not doubt, do not let one single soul in this room or any other tell you that love must ask permission of a title. It must not, it must never. I gave 60 years to learning it, and I have only you left to teach it to." She sat back, spent, and the whole hall stared at the Dowager Duchess of Brackenmere Hollow, who had never in living memory shed a tear or bent an inch, weeping openly over a servant's child. "Go and find her, you great fool, go now, before you turn to stone, as I did." Serapha was standing in the shadows at the foot of the servants' stairs. She had come up in a panic the moment she found Nerys's cot empty, following the small trail of astonished footmen, and she had reached the doorway of the great hall in time to hear every word the Duke had spoken. She had heard him refuse a duchess. She had heard him name her the finest and bravest woman he had ever known before all the North. She had stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, and her heart breaking and mending and breaking again, and she had not dared to come one step further into the light, because a still room maid did not walk into such a room, not even now, not even after all of that. Caedmon found her there in the shadows with her daughter's hand in his. "I told you once," he said, "that it was dangerous to be looked at by someone who sees the man and not the title. Do you remember?" "I remember," Serapha whispered. "I did not tell you why." He drew a breath. Behind him, the whole hall waited, silent, watching, but he had ceased to care, in the smallest degree, what any of them thought. "It is dangerous, Serapha, because a man who has been seen truly cannot ever again bear to be with anyone who does not see him. I have been seen by you and by your daughter, and now the whole cold world I was raised to want is ashes in my mouth, and there is only one thing left on this earth that I want at all." He went down on one knee before her, in the shadows at the foot of the servants' stair, the way he had knelt in the grass to be a child's dragon, the way he had knelt in the great hall to lift a child into his arms, and he took her work-roughened hand in both of his. "Marry me, not the Duke, the man beneath the tree, who pretended to sleep so the world would leave him be, and woke to find the only thing worth waking for." Marry me, Serapha. Be my finest and bravest woman for the rest of my life, and let me be Neris's tree until she is grown, and after." Serapha looked down at the beautiful, gentle, weeping man kneeling before her, and at the child between them, looking up with wide grey eyes that were her mother's own. And she felt the tide she had commanded down for 2 long years rise up at last past all commanding, and she let it come. "Yes," she said. "Oh, yes." And Neris, who understood almost none of it and all of it at once, clapped her small hands together in pure delight, and announced to the great hall, the gentry, the dowager, and the wide listening night, "He's our tree now." And the whole cold, proud north of England gathered to see a duke sold into duty, saw instead a duke go down on his knee to a fisherman's widow for love, and did not in the end know what to do but weep and rise and cheer. They were married that autumn in the small stone chapel on the island, with the sea mist curling white against the windows and the whole village crowded in at the back. The very village that had once whispered so cruelly at a lonely young widow now came to see her wed her duke. The dowager duchess gave the bride away with her own iron hand, and was heard to say to more than one astonished dowager of her acquaintance that her grandson had shown more sense in one September night than the whole family had shown in 3 generations, and that she would thank them to keep their opinions of it behind their teeth. The Lady Ophira Callenmore came north for the wedding, radiant and free, on the arm of her poor gentleman, to whom she was married herself before the year was out. And Nerissa Vey, 3 years old, wore a crown of orchard clover down the aisle and fell asleep halfway through the vows against the shoulder of the man she had chosen for herself beneath a willow tree, which everyone agreed was exactly as it should be. Many years afterward, on a warm summer afternoon, when the silver-leaf orchards of Brackenmere Hollow were heavy with fruit, and the sea lay calm and blue beneath the cliffs, a young woman of perhaps 18 years walked out along the old cliff path toward the ancient moon willow, with her skirts gathered in one hand and her dark grey eyes bright with laughter. She had grown tall and lovely, with a tumble of golden hair going bronze at the temples now in the sun, and she moved with the easy confidence of a person who has been, every day of her remembered life, entirely and unshakably loved. Beneath the willow, an older man lay in the long grass with his hat over his eyes, pretending, as he still liked to pretend on the finest afternoons, to be asleep. His dark hair had gone grey at the temples, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that came only from years of laughing, but he was handsome yet, and at peace in a way the cold boy he had once been could never have imagined. Not far off, a woman with dark hair threaded through with silver sat sketching the orchard light, still lovely, lovelier now perhaps than she had been at 22, for the fear had long since gone out of her face and left only the gentleness behind. Nerissa crept up on the sleeping man exactly as she had crept up on him 15 summers before, and she curled herself down beside him in the grass, tall as she was now, and laid her head upon his chest, as she had done when she was 3 years old, and knew nothing of the world, but that here was a good and safe place to rest. "You are not asleep," she said. "You have not been asleep beneath this tree since the summer I was 3. I know your tricks, Papa." Di Cadmon Ravarin lifted the hat from his face and smiled at the daughter of his heart, whom he had raised as his own from the night she had crossed a great hall on her bare feet to claim him before the whole of the north. "No," he agreed, "but it is a very fine thing to be woken when one has the right person to do the waking." He looked past her to where her mother sat, sketching in the gold light, and his eyes softened as they had softened every day for 15 years. "I learned that once, from a very small and very wise person who mistook me for a tree." "She was terribly clever, that person," said Nerissa. "She was the cleverest person I ever met," said her father. "She looked at a man everyone had agreed was made of ice, and she saw straight through to the truth of him, and she would not leave him to freeze." I owe her everything I have. I owe her my whole life. And below the cliffs, the northern sea came in against the ancient stone, carrying its old promises back to shore as it had always done, and the light lay long and gold over Brackenmere Hollow, where a duke who had once pretended to sleep so that the world would leave him alone had been woken instead into the only life worth living by a child who had wanted nothing from him at all but a warm place to rest her head. If this story found its way into your heart, stay with me a while longer and let me tell you another.